Today we are going to be discussing guerrilla warfare in the 20th century, specifically in the Cuban Revolution and the Chinese Civil War. Unfortunately, Courtney Beers is not with us today. Our question was, guerrilla warfare was an important factor in achieving success in 20th century wars. To what extent do you agree with this statement? This led to our thesis, in 20th century wars such as the Chinese Civil War and the Cuban Revolution, guerrilla warfare was a very important factor in achieving success because both revolutionary leaders' usage of the tactics enabled their victory. In order to understand this, we first must introduce the causes of both the Chinese Civil War and the Cuban Revolution. The Chinese Civil War was caused by a large variety of both long-term and short-term causes. The most important causes were political ones, such as the Wuchang Uprising, the fall of the Qing dynasty, warlordism, and the May 4th movement. An economic cause of the Chinese Civil War is that less than 1% of the population was rich, while everyone else was very poor, and Mao wanted the peasants to rise up against the bourgeoisie. Military causes include the Northern Expedition, White Terror, and Nanchang Uprising. Finally, social causes of the Chinese Civil War include the missionaries. Within the Cuban Revolution, this was caused by several political, economic, military, and social conflicts. One of the most important political causes was the decline of Spain as an imperial power and Cuba's lack of an overriding superpower. An economic cause of the Cuban Revolution was the rise of sugar trade and sugar culture within the region, shifting it to rely completely on this trade. Militarily, the First Rebellion, in the still Spain's Cuba from 1868 to 1878, was a primary factor into the beginning of the Cuban Rebellion. The final cause was socially, where there were many poor and few rich Cubans, angry at the social structure of their country. The basic principles of guerrilla warfare derived from both Mao and Che's differing opinions on it are overall the tactical ambush attacks must be in small numbers of men, and usually these men are not heavily trained in tactical warfare. Leading to the quote by Che Guevara, guerrilla warfare is used by the side which is supported by a majority, those that are oppressed, but which possesses a much smaller number of arms for use in defense against oppression, because they are usually not heavily trained. This leads to the Lin Bao quatrain.
Lin Bao was one of Mao's commanders during the Chinese Civil War, and he was titled the Marshal of the People's Republic of China. And he has a quatrain on guerrilla warfare, which is, "The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. And when the enemy retreats, we pursue." And this outlines all the major like the essence of guerrilla warfare, in that it's based around ambush attacks, and that when the enemy advances, we retreat and hide and don't attack because we don't have as well-trained forces. But when the enemy camps, we harass them and ambush, and when the enemy tires, we attack and ambush, and when they retreat, we pursue. And Mao believed in drawing back your fist before you strike, meaning that you must plan your attacks and your ambushes so that the enemy is most vulnerable. And both of these tactics were also used by Che Guevara in the Cuban Revolution when he was making his way to Havana from the Sierra Maestras, and specifically in Santa Clara, which we'll go over later. Mao's On Guerrilla Warfare was basically his manuscript on what guerrilla warfare is and how it's fought. And it's blocked off into chapters, and he goes over what guerrilla warfare is and how it's related to conventional warfare, in that guerrilla warfare is all tactical ambushes when the enemy doesn't know you're there, versus conventional warfare when both sides know where the other is and plan their attacks based on that. And then he moves on to guerrilla warfare through history, and then speaks about what can be attained by guerrilla operations. And he believes that wars cannot be ultimately ended by guerrilla warfare, but they are very useful in fighting wars. And Then he moves on to the organization of guerrilla warfare in small ambushing units and the political problems of guerrilla warfare, such as it's the oppressed coming over the oppressors. And then finally, in Chapter 7, he goes over the strategy of guerrilla resistance against Japan, which is specific to Mao. And now we have an excerpt from Che Guevara's reading. The main essence of Che's opinions on guerrilla warfare is that the guerrilla fighter is the most important part of guerrilla warfare. Unlike Mao, he believes that it's not the leaders who are the most important, it's the actual fighters, and that's what wins the war. And that the group should be limited to about 5 to 10 men so that they can have the most success in their ambushes. And that guerrilla fighters are not terrorists. They only kill the oppressors and not innocent civilians because as they come from the peasantry and lower social class, they believe that they should benefit while the oppressors should not. And finally, he goes over favorable grounds and goes over that guerrilla warfare must be fought in rural settings in the countryside, mountains, and marshes where conventional forces can't fight the best. And this is how they achieved success through the Cuban Revolution and the Chinese Civil War.
For specific battles that guerrilla warfare was used in both the Chinese Civil War and the Cuban Revolution, we start off with Manchuria, with Mao destroying the GMD railways and kicking their forces out of their own camps using guerrilla tactics. But these guerrilla tactics were also used in campaigns during the Chinese Civil War, such as the Liu Shan campaign, the Wai Wai campaign, and the Pingjing campaign. And in these campaigns, Mao used guerrilla warfare tactics to decide not to attack major cities head-on, but rather to weaken the KMT's forces by attacking first the smaller cities and then going after their real goal. And also Mao chose to encircle Chiang's armies quickly to cut them off, which is another guerrilla warfare tactic that Mao covers in his own guerrilla warfare. And all these tactics were used amongst the various CCP campaigns to aid Mao in achieving victory during the Chinese Civil War. So in the Cuban Revolution, one of the instances where guerrilla warfare tactics were utilized by Che was in the Battle of Santa Clara in 1958 to 1959. And Che used guerrilla tactics to surround and eventually capture the city of Santa Clara on his way to Havana. And this eventually led to him taking over the Batista regime and Batista fleeing Cuba, leaving Fidel Castro in charge. So to conclude what we've been talking about, we must note that guerrilla warfare was arguably the most important factor for both Mao and Che in their respective 20th century wars. And that's because coming from peasantry, guerrilla warfare was one of the only tactics that were even going to be feasible for them to spark a rebellion and achieve success. And also, despite the common thought, guerrilla warfare was successful in ending a war because Mao used the tactics in his various campaigns, and it gave him control of Manchuria ultimately, and that led to the end of the Chinese Civil War, whereas Che used guerrilla warfare tactics to rally local fighters to end the Cuban Revolution in Havana in 1959. Now, just to wrap up everything, we're going to go over some effects of the Cuban Revolution on Cuba, which is in our epilogue here. So we first have to look at the initial strong relations with USSR and Castro, with them nationalizing all private property. And so the U.S. canceled all their sugar contracts with Cuba. And then what happened was they decided to do sugar of Cuba for Soviet oil. And that kind of led to the recognition of Cuba by the USSR. And the U.S. then put embargo and travel restrictions for Cuba in 1960. But Cuba continued to progress because of their high literacy rates and their low infant mortality. But the economy could never actually rebound. And that was mainly because of the whole U.S. embargo. But the USSR did have some aid, such as with their trade. but that was only until Angola, when the Soviets were not ready for the Angolan Revolution. And this concludes our screencast on 2 guerrilla warfares in the 20th century, focusing on the Chinese Civil War and the Cuban Revolution.